Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper here. Today we are going to have another Morsels for Mental Manducation, continuing our discussion of C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity, this time with Chapter 3. But first, in a nice little bent billiard, this is branded Borkham Riff. It was made for them by Stanwell. And when I first got it, it was a very light, natural color. It is coloring up nicely. It is unfinished. In it, another bowl of Lane's Medal of Valor. A nice medium English. Well, let's dive right in. In Chapter 3, Lewis circles back and reiterates his points from Chapter 1 in order to talk about the reality of this law of human nature or moral law. If you recall, those points from Chapter 1 were that worldwide, every culture shares some common ideas about what is right, what is fair play, what is moral, what is wrong. And worldwide, we don't live up to those. Now, some people are going to say, as he points out, so all you've done is demonstrate that humans aren't perfect. Well, duh, we knew that. But that is actually an important point to make. Why? Well, think about his examples. He uses a tree and a stone. Let's just talk about the stone. When you say that a stone is bad, you simply mean that it doesn't suit your purpose. It doesn't skip correctly when you toss it on a pond, or it doesn't fit a particular spot when you're trying to build a stone wall. You don't mean that the stone itself is bad. You simply mean that it doesn't work for me. Same thing with the tree. A tree is what it is based on how much water it's gotten and temperatures and wind and sun and etc. When you say that a tree is bad, you simply mean that it's not producing fruit, or it's not providing the kind of shade that you wanted it to. When you say that a human is bad, it's not what you mean. There's a moral judgment there. The human is bad in a completely different way than the tree is bad. And he points out that this in fact is why he looks at what we often call the laws of nature. And he says they're not really laws at all. They can't be broken. They merely describe what nature is. And a stone thrown up can't do anything else except fall down. It doesn't think in midair, oh, I must remember, I'm supposed to fall down. Humans, on the other hand, when we talk about the law of human nature or the moral law, we're not describing what is, because we've already seen that humans don't live up to what we call the law of human nature in ways that nature does have to live up to the laws of nature. And so this concept of ought makes natural law a descriptive, whereas moral law is proscriptive. It tells us what we ought to do, and yet we don't. Now, this chapter could very well have been labeled more objections, because what he's really doing in the second half of this chapter is discussing two more objections to this notion that there is, in fact, this universal set of things that we agree on, that we call a moral law, and that we don't live up to them. One of those is, well, isn't this thing that we say a man ought to do, doesn't that just coincide with things that are convenient to us? he sets out a very good example that shows why this is not the case. And keeping in mind the context of this chapter wasn't written as a chapter. It was presented again as a radio show during World War II. And so the context of his example, it's very appropriate. But as soon as you see the example, you can think of so many more examples from your own experience. His example is that of a traitor. The behavior of a traitor to an enemy may very well benefit me, right? Help me attack some fortress or naval port or something of the enemy. But I am always going to despise the man who is a traitor. Why? He can't be trusted. It really is. It's that simple. Another example that isn't quite so dark, but highlights the practicality of this. I'm not more than temporarily or superficially angry at someone who accidentally trips me. I'm upset briefly because I'm embarrassed to fall, or I'm angry for having been tripped. But that anger is short-lived, and I immediately realize that it was ill-placed because the person didn't intend to trip me. Now I am angry with someone who tries to trip me, even if he fails. Why? One of them actually harmed me, the other one didn't, and yet my anger is directed where? Why? Another objection that he deals with here is, isn't ought just another way of saying what's good for society? And again, he gives an example that will make you think of many more on your own. He says, we ought to be unselfish. Well, we all agree on that. Selfishness is a bad thing. Well, why? Well, in this context, because it's good for society for you to not be selfish. Well, but why do I care what's good for society if it doesn't benefit me personally? Well, because you ought to be unselfish. It's a circular argument. You can't give a reason for me not to be unselfish in the societal context without simply restating the same thing over and over again. Why shouldn't I be selfish if it doesn't benefit me personally? If it benefits me personally, then we're back to square one. But that's not the context of this. The context of this is, even if an action doesn't benefit you, if it benefits society, then you ought to do it. Why? Because you ought to. It becomes very circular. It's basically a way of saying that a certain behavior is moral, well, because it's moral. And when we reach that kind of an impasse, we see that the moral law actually sits outside of us in a way that the natural law doesn't sit outside of nature. The natural law simply describes nature as it is. The moral law describes us as we ought to be, not as we are. And in that sense, it sits on a different plane from us. It sits outside of us. It's a very real thing. We all point to it. As he points out in chapter 1, we all complain if we're treated unfairly. It does not matter where you live on the planet. If you are treated in a way that is unfair, you will complain. And what's unfair and what's fair is pretty consistent around the world. So we have this very real sense of morality that sits outside of us. And that is where we leave off this chapter. So, while you ponder that, while you think about your objections, comments, leave them below. Light something you like. It's good for pondering. Enjoy your afternoon.